Hi, I'm Terry. I'm one of the midwives in independent practice in the Harvey Bay, Fraser Coast area, Gympie, that sort of area, and we're really excited about what we're going to talk about today. And now it's over to you, Deb.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. Welcome back, everybody, to the Dreaded Midwives. It's just Terry and I today. Kristy, our lovely mother, our maiden, is busy with babies, I'm assuming. She said she was busy today. Um, so, birth happens. Not much we can do about that. Do apologise about the late interval between podcasts, but we've all been busy. But we're ready, aren't we, Terry?
We certainly are. We've got lots of things we want to talk about. And we had to really crunch it all aside and come up with something that seems to be a relevant issue for a lot of women, and especially women that we've been looking after lately. So
Definitely. So obviously, that's a big topic. Talking about what we're talking about today is vaginal birth after cesarean or home birth.
And I think
after
it sort of follows through from it comes from our last one as well, is that we talked about a transfer, and we got to the point where we got the dear woman into the ambulance or into the car and at the doors of the hospital. And I think that's really interesting because that's when the options of care and outcomes really come to the fore. And I think the biggest thing that is on a lot of women's minds at that time as they enter in, will my birth land up to be a cesarean section? So we're going to leave that section and go on to, well, all right, second try, maybe third try. What does a VBAC look like? And particularly for my business, what does a HBAC look like?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Mind you, sorry, I had to think about that for a minute. I must admit, transferring into the hospital, and I just want to add this little bit before we jump too far into the VBAC scenario, is just to reassure women, transferring into the hospital, it really is a 50-50 chance that you're going to have a cesarean section.
Well,
Like, I just looked at my stats for the last 2 years, and there's been one.
Can I just say though, the stats probably say it's less than 50-50.
Yeah.
And I think that would be interesting. I mean, obviously there's a lot of articles out there that talk about the stats, but I actually think it's probably less likely than more likely. So, but I do think it's one of the biggest fears women have, that, you know, they're moving into a more medicalized, and what does that look like at the end? And the looming fear, the elephant in the room, is, what if I land up having a cesarean section?
Yeah.
I think that's probably where I went with it, rather than it being a likely outcome as
no, that's why I just sort of paused, and I sort of thought, oh, maybe we should hold off on the VBAC talk, because maybe we should talk about, but then again, I've prepared everything for VBAC today. So let's talk about that.
Well, I think it's a really good idea, because if we can get rid of the elephant in the room, then we can go on and talk more about the transfer and what that looks like.
And I think I'm sorry, Terry. It just threw me off a little bit, and I was like, oh, I'm all prepared to talk about VBAC, but we haven't really talked about what happens if we do transfer. But no, it's actually perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Let's talk about the VBAC. Let's talk about, and the reality is, if you birth in the hospital, you are more likely to have a cesarean section, regardless of hospital transfer. You are more likely to have a cesarean section. I think the current rate for a private hospital is around 60%. And I think the current public hospital rate is around 30 or 40. Maybe less. I'm not sure. What's your latest info on
I think that's pretty close. It really depends on the hospital and the staff that are at the hospital, usually
Yeah,
the obstetrical team as well.
yeah,
And then you look at home birth, and generally speaking, the rate of cesarean section rate is quite low. So
yeah.
it's well within the World Health
Mm,
Organization's feeling
13%.
that we shouldn't have any more than 15%.
Yeah, yeah.
So home birth is well and truly below that. So yeah, so it is a bit of an elephant in the room when a woman transfers.
Yeah.
And a lot of women, for lots of reasons, sort of give their power away, or they're overwhelmed by the situation. They're exhausted, their husband's tired, he's afraid, things start, and we've heard about the cascade of interventions
Yeah.
that can and there's a lot of things involved in that as well, with the attitude of the people that, the professionals that we are greeted by at the hospital, um,
Absolutely. Mm.
and I think risk sort of puts them, oh my God, it's a home birth, let's get the operating theater ready to go. And I know that, working in the hospital, that sometimes is the sort of attitude of the staff when a home birth mother transfers. So I think that's a valid point. But I think that you're right. We need to just, let's move into the elephant in the room, get rid of the myths and the stuff behind
Choosing to be that.
yeah, of cesarean sections and VBAC. So
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's
can I start by asking you a question,
yeah,
Deb,
go on,
about
ask.
VBAC?
Yeah,
As a home birth midwife, in your practice, and you've been practicing for a long time now,
yeah.
um, what is your sort of estimated rates of women seeking a home birth after a cesarean section?
Interesting. I actually had nobody last year, just as a side note, but this year I've had quite a few inquiries. When I was in Brisbane, there was certainly a lot more inquiries. It's funny because when I first started out in private practice, I went to my to a midwife that I looked up very much, like Jodie in Brisbane. I looked up to her very much as a privately practicing midwife. Um, and I remember saying to her, "Oh no, I'm just going to look after multis or women who've had children before. I don't want to look after VBAC women. I don't want to look up. They're too high risk, and I don't want to look after primips because they're too much hard work." Well, she laughed and she said, "Come back and see me in 12 months' time and see how you feel about that." Well, I absolutely love working with VBAC women. I, and I love working with primips or first time mums. Yeah, I couldn't tell you how many I looked at, how many I look after. I probably a quarter of the women that I've looked after have been VBAC women.
Yeah.
It took a lot of trust for me to trust that very first woman. Just as she trusted me to look after her, I had to step into trust myself and to trust her. I've come from a hospital system. I come from the hospital system where VBAC women are high risk. She's got a 1 in 200 chance of uterine rupture. So therefore, we must monitor her. We must put IV cannulations in. We can't let her do this and we can't do that. And, can't have water immersion. And, just this whole can't. And then
Mm.
stepping into the world of home birth after cesarean, where I don't have those things. I don't have the IV cannula. Well, I can if I wanted to, but I don't have, the continuous monitoring. And I'm fully trusting this woman. And that was the biggest learning curve for me. And what I learned was that these women are powerful. They've made up their mind. They're like, nah, you took away my power that first time. Not me, but whoever. took away my power that first time. Nobody believed in me. I believe in me. This is the woman speaking.
Yes.
Nobody believed me that first time, and I'm going to prove you all wrong because I know I can give birth vaginally.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do it.
It's interesting because one of my favorite websites sends an email or a newsletter monthly or weekly or something. Anyway, they have put up there a download, which is called The 13 Myths of VBACs. Okay. And I think that, you sort of like it is, and a lot of it's because of fear and that sort of thing. And the opening line in this is, many people believe once a cesarean, always a cesarean. This prevailing conventional wisdom is greatly influenced by persistent, pervasive myths about vaginal birth after cesarean section, and it's time for clarification or clarity. So I think, I've been since the 70s, late 70s, I've been attending women in birth. Now, our cesarean section rate wasn't as high as it is now. I would say it was well and truly within the World Health Organization expectation of a birth. So we didn't get that many, but my first birth that I attended was a cesarean section. And I thought it was really interesting seeing that I was going into midwifery. But it also, once a woman had a cesarean section in the 70s and 80s, it was expected that she would always have a cesarean section. And to be honest, I don't know if there was any research to back that up, but that was the culture in which I received my training. In England, there's also expectation in Canada at that time. So, so to come from that hospital system as a midwife with that sort of culture and that myth, and then move into a home environment where you don't have all those things that go ping to safeguard yourself and the woman, and the baby, that would take a huge step up and a step of faith, really, and trust in that woman.
Yeah, well, I've been looking at a few studies, and a lot of studies they looked at were done like in the 80s and 90s, and it's interesting because back then the cesarean rate was only 20%. Which I'm being very mindful here that I'm not going to fall down another rabbit hole around the whole continuous monitoring intervention increasing. So that is another podcast, because I could go on about that one forever as well. But I just found it really interesting what they were saying about how there was actually similar, not quite, but there was still, even with elective cesarean, repeat cesarean section, there was still uterine rupture. Even with elective cesarean. And one thing I kept thinking when I was reading it, I took a client once. Well, I didn't take her, I just went with her for support to see an obstetrician. And she wanted to have a VBAC. And she had the cesarean the first time because she was came in fully dilated with a breech. And at that time, at this particular hospital, there was no vaginal breaches at all. You could come in fully, it could be your 10th baby, and it didn't matter. You were going for a cesarean section. Anyway, so she'd come in fully, and they took a whisk off for a cesarean section, and of course she's breech again this time. And the obstetrician's like, well, no, you can't have a vaginal breech, all this stuff. And he said, look, I just don't know why you don't have another repeat cesarean section. There's no risk involved. Anyway, this mum, and it took me by surprise because I hadn't coached her or anything. She must have done her research. And she's like, well, actually, what about the risk of this, and rattled off all these risks. And he was just like, oh, yeah, but, they're only minor risks. And she was like, yeah, but for who? Who's that a minor risk to? These aren't minor risks for me. What you're asking of me. And that was such a powerful example of these women who they've done their research.
Yes.
They know. They're not going to be swayed by some doctor telling you that it's, you know, there's no risk. They've researched, they've looked at what their risk is.
Yeah.
No, and yeah.
And it's interesting, that whole VBAC thing. Okay, so back in the 70s and 80s, they didn't actually call it a VBAC. They actually called it what it was, a trial of scar.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that was really what, that was their concern, like you say.
Yeah.
They were worried about the scar rupturing or dehissing. I don't think they were really worried about, and let's really define what rupture looks like, and the misuse of the word, because when we were talking about trial of scar, they were actually looking at how labor would affect the scar. Now we also have to understand, at a certain time in history, we went from doing a transverse scar, so an up and down. So from the top of the fundus down to, and that's how, you know, like a book, they would open it up and take the baby out. And so that's understandable that there would have been a time where that scar, and not the uterus, but the scar will open. And that isn't the same thing as a rupture. We're actually talking about a dehisced.
But do you find people are reporting a dehiscence as a rupture?
That's right. And I think that word rupture is used very loosely in the medical model of care. Oh, you've got this rupture. Well, in actual fact, it's not a rupture. It's a dehiscence at the scar site. So anyway, when they stopped doing this scar that was, you know, from the top of the fundus to the bottom, and started doing a lower segment, the reason being is because they found that there was more and more dehissing with future births. So and they understood, they learned that the lower segment of the uterus is much less likely to have to be the battlefield, shall we say, for labor. So the risks were lower because of that sort of biophysical sort of reality of the uterus in labor. So that was interesting, getting rid of that trial of scar and now being replaced with a vaginal birth after cesarean section. And can I just move on from that? In the things that they did in order to trial for the scar, there were certain restrictions, and they're very different to what they are nowadays. The restrictions were that you would not be induced if you had a previous section. Because if we believe that uterine scar was vulnerable, then you didn't want to artificially cause the uterus to.
Well, there's still actually a lot of research to support that, but go on.
No, that's it. And the other one, and I'd love you to talk more about that. And the other thing was, you could not have an epidural, because you wouldn't then know if there was a rupture or a dehiscence, which we'll call a spade here. It's a dehiscence of the scar. So those two things were not allowed or were frowned upon in the early days. So so I'd like to hear more what you're thinking with the induction of labor and
I'm over here looking which paper I found it in. Sorry, there is quite a few bits of things I've got here. The 4 studies. Risk of uterine rupture during labor among women with a prior caesarean delivery, which was actually really interesting. So uterine rupture. Okay, here's what it says here. Elective repeat caesarean section with no labor is 1 in 634. The chance that you might have a ruptured
uterus.
That's a ruptured uterus. For all purposes, I don't know whether we're going dehiscence or rupture. This is the study. So with spontaneous onset of labor, 1 in 200, there is a chance that you might have a uterine rupture. which is what we know that. Induction of labour with prostaglandin, you have a 1 in 130 chance of uterine rupture. Induction of labour with prostaglandin, induction of labour without prostaglandin is 1 in 130. And induction of labour with prostaglandin, this is for a VBAC woman, the risk of uterine rupture, or the chance of a uterine rupture, is 3 in 100. So that's pretty much, you were saying that.
And what year was that study, Deb? Because I know that we've changed the study.
This was published in July the 5th, 2001.
Okay, so we're looking at,
they've looked at, what they've done is they looked at a number of different studies.
Yeah. So it's a bit like a Cochrane review in a way, isn't it?
No, sorry, that was a study on its own. What I'm reading is the summary of 4 largest and most recent VBAC and elective repeat Caesarean studies by Gretchen Humphreys. And that was the first study.
Yeah. And so we're looking at that. I mean, there's so many things that have changed, hasn't there? Been like we've stopped using the gel because we found that the gel, you couldn't actually get it out of the vagina once you put it in because it comes with so many risks. And that if there any of those risk factors show themselves, you can't go in and remove the gel. So what they've done now, of course, is in order to get away from that is now they're using the tape. And a lot of people refer to it as the tape, so that tape can be removed. But then you have to think it's mucous membrane. And even though you're removing the tape, you're not actually removing a lot of the chemical that's in there.
The chemical's already there,
So there's still going to be risks, but there are reduced risks. So that makes a lot of sense. It's interesting. I would love to know how they define uterine rupture. Again,
okay. So here's another study. Study 3 was vaginal birth after Caesarean uterine rupture rates in California. It was done in 1999. The overall Caesarean rate, isn't it interesting? In 1999, the overall Caesarean rate was 20.8, and the introduction of CTGs. So that first study was done between 87 and 96, and in 92 was the introduction of CTGs. So anyway, at previous, I'm just having a listen to this. No, they didn't define. The study design did not allow for objective definition of uterine rupture. There you go.
It didn't allow for it. Now, I would think that very likely, to be honest, I'm not sure what a normal rupture rate is for a uterus that hasn't been incised. That would be an interesting thing to follow up. Like, I don't think uteruses are meant to rupture. I mean, so I do think that if they're talking about rupture, my feeling would be is that they're talking about the hiss at the scar. And what does that look like? And you know, for one thing, if you want to look at a dehiss rather than a rupture. Now, a rupture means that there's going to be an outrageous amount of blood loss. Because you're rupturing,
and the pain would be
and vascular. But women that are actually have a dehiss, a lot of times, in my experience, don't even know that they're, you know, when they go in to do the repeat section or whatever, the repeat section, they open up the skin and then the muscles, and then they see a little bit of hair of the baby's head coming through the scar, and that woman, who knows how long that's been sitting there?
Well, I remember a client coming in, and she was coming in for an elective Caesar, and it had already started to dishiss. So when they went to cut the uterus, it was, you know, to come through the uterus, it was already, they could see the baby's hair coming through already, and she hadn't even been in labor, and she had no pain. There was no fetal compromise.
Now, there's no bleeding, there's no maternal compromise. So what a rupture. And I mean, that's such a word, isn't it? I mean, honestly,
it does. It
you know,
sounds
it's
like,
something that you'd think that
it sounds like the baby's going to explode
you know,
through the uterus.
that's quite dramatic.
Yeah. But
Yeah, but a dehiss sounds a little bit more gentle than
it does sound a bit more gentle. And it's interesting, I can't remember which one I read it in, that they were saying that women who are having an induction of labour are just as likely to have a uterine rupture as, actually more likely be a uterine rupture, not a dishiss, with an induction of labour. Women who choose a primate, a first-time mum choosing to have, I'm looking for the study, sorry. The risk of, here it is. So here we are. Here's your risks. So your not risks. Considering this is the risk associated with a VBAC is worth briefly describing what is involved. Uterine rupture can happen at any birth, even when no scar is present, particularly if syntocinon is used. There are two types of uterine rupture associated with VBAC. So you've got your catastrophic, which is your symptomatic. The old scar separates along its length, the amniotic sac ruptures, and the baby is pushed into the abdominal cavity. This results in significant bleeding, shock, and the baby is in grave danger, which is what you were just saying. That sounds like that traumatic uterine rupture. And the asymptomatic, where the scar separates partway along its length, the amniotic sac stays intact, and the baby remains in the uterus. Bleeding and shock is minimal, and the baby usually survives. This is the most common type. Which is really interesting.
So,
which is exactly
all right. So interesting. So what the doctors are saying, and that's something I guess that women need to consider when they go in for that. Sometimes some women might not even go in to have an obstetrical review prior to having a VBAC, but you know, it's something they need to consider and ask for definitions, you know, and get it clear. Like if stats are thrown at her, she then can look, well, how often is it life-threatening, as in a catastrophic? Is it an actual rupture of the uterus, or is it a dehiss? Because in my mind, to be honest with you, if we're doing lower segment cesarean section, so the scars down there, what difference does it make to the baby? It's an outlet. So, you know, I mean, so the baby misses the mark and doesn't go out through the os and move into the pelvis in through the os, but it finds a hole.
It comes out.
And because it hasn't read the book, it might say, oh, this is a nice little exit. You know, it's all ready for me. I don't have to bash my head against the 3, 4, 7 centimeters cervix, whatever. But, you know, whatever they think, who knows? But it's an interesting thing that what would put them at risk in that sort of situation any more than coming into the vagina and going through there, unless, of course, what you're talking about is the catastrophic ones where, you know, where there's bleeding, the membranes rupture, and the baby lands up in the abdominal cavity. So then you'd have the whole thing.
A lot of these studies talked about, you know, that babies that did die, and there wasn't that much a significant difference between those choosing an elective repeat cesarean and trial of labour or a VBAC. So there wasn't a significant difference. But again, the studies couldn't say why. They didn't say the baby, it was because of uterine rupture. Do you know what I mean? Like the studies, when they looked at the mortality, morbidity, and all that sort of stuff, it couldn't really give you a reason why. But reading Rachel Reed, I think the article was called "A Mountain Out of a Molehill," VBAC. I love what she says in it. You know, like, sadly, there is no guarantees in childbirth, and whether you're having a VBAC or your first baby or your 7th baby, whether you're in the hospital or whether you're at home, we can't guarantee anything. We can't guarantee outcomes. We can look at the studies and and all that sort of stuff. That sounds a bit morbid, but I do like to say that to couples when I'm meeting them, you know, because especially out here in a rural area, with sometimes a long way from the hospital.
Yeah, it's interesting that whole idea of you know, yes, uncertainties they're a bit like anything. I mean, you jump in the car, like I've just recently done, and I went to New South Wales, and there were flood warnings, and honestly, I was going through water that was a meter deep under the guidance of, the highway patrol people. So I didn't just, I wasn't a fool for if it's flooded sort of person. But it's interesting because there are always going to be uncertainties in any sort of movement forward. You know, you could stub your toe, or you could fall down the stairs, or you could have the uncertainties of labor and birth, of course, no matter where you are. But I think what I fall back onto with that in mind is that nature has been doing this for a very, very, very long time.
Yep.
And I think that I feel that nature is very intelligent, and that if there was going to be a fault in the machinery, she would have figured it out a long, long time ago, you know, and so the risks or the uncertainties are fairly minimal. I mean, we're not like fish or turtles or birds where you have lots of babies, or spiders. We have lots of babies because, you know, like 3/4 of them are going to, you know, if not 90% of them are going to pass over in some sort of weird and wonderful way. We don't have that same high numbers. So nature's actually taking care of that quite nicely and done her homework, you know, because she wants to survive. So I think over, you know, at least 60,000 years, I think she's got it pretty well tuned. So that's
it's pretty good, isn't it? Well, and I'm going to, I have to say this book, if you are planning a VBAC, Birth After Caesarean by Hazel Keedle, the beautiful Rangi midwife lent it to me. She popped up the other day to see me and lent it to me, and she actually talks a lot about, and I'm sure there's other books that do it as well, but I've read that one, talks about how a bit like Michel Odent, and he talks about the farmer and the obstetrician in that book, where with the, you know, in the 1900s, they took birthing of midwives. They regulated them, and sounds familiar. They regulated them and controlled them and slandered them and did all these things, and so took birth of women who'd been supporting women for generations, and then they moved it into the hospital system, and that's when they trialed all those different, you know, the twilight drugs and all that sort of stuff. And so with that then come instrumental deliveries, and, you know, and you can see the pattern. And have you read that book by Michel Odent, The Farmer and the Obstetrician?
I do think that's interesting, given where we are now, trialing experimental practices and treatments. It's very interesting that they were doing it to women back in the 19th century. But that's it. How could they not have? Because birthing was not under the umbrella of medicine. So given that they knew very little, I can see how that was experimental, using the twilight sleep and doing cesarean sections, not knowing the best way forward, doing the up and down rather than, you know, I mean, yes, in the last 200 years, they've learned a lot, or 100 years, but yeah, that's really interesting. But no, Michel Odent is probably one of my heroes. So what does he have to say about this whole?
I've just read the excerpt. Is that of the book? Excerpt of the book, where he talks about with the industrial age, as we've got more and more machinery in the farming world, bigger machines that can do more jobs and less workers on the farm. in the obstetric world, we've got more and more practices that are taking away the farmers, the midwives out of the room.
Yes.
Does that make
yes,
sense? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So I think, I guess when a woman has had a cesarean section, and then she goes and has another, goes and falls pregnant, has another pregnancy, and a lot of women at that time, because they've been, a lot of women have got lots of stuff riding on the previous, and usually it's traumatic, it's emergency, it's not something that's expected, it's one of those uncertainties, and they might have a lot of energy and emotion around it. So a lot of them have actually been convinced that they're going to need some sort of medical care. So even in any situation, there is this sort of expectation, I guess, by society that if you've had a section, that you would go and see an obstetrician the next time around. And I think that, so that brings us to, what is going to be said, the culture of the hospital and the obstetrician. And of course, because they've had a whole history themselves with, drama and dealing with the uncertainties, that they're probably going to be pretty well tied into, looking at the worst case scenarios at that conference or at that consultation. So I think women need to be really aware, and we've hit on a few points, haven't we, about the wording that will be used, the expectation of care, sort of the framework or the pathway of care. So I think that's interesting that that's their art. They're good with tools, and that's what they've been trained up to administer. So I think that's a really important part.
And it's really powerful, the wording, just as I'm listening to you speak then, the 1 in 2, there's a risk that you're going to have a uterine rupture, 1 in 200, instead of going, there's a 199 chance that you're going to have a perfectly fine outcome, and
Yes,
instead of, just the wording can be so different. Like, it sounds so different, and that impacts so differently on your decision making. If I was to say to you, you've got 199% chance in 200, or a 1 in 999 chance that you are going to have a completely uneventful, outcome, or VBAC, or whatever.
Natural vaginal birth, that's right. Exactly.
Yeah, it just takes away, it's just like, that sounds so much better. But that 1 in 200, and we have to acknowledge that's the doctor's job. That's what we need obstetricians for. We need them for those moments.
We need them for the one amongst the 200.
For the one.
Yes.
Yeah, and
that's
their
right.
job is to inform the woman of that one. I think what upsets me is that the brushing off of the risk of repeat Caesars, that's just sort of skimmed over without actually addressing that. And I think they make the uterine rupture sound so catastrophic and deadly for mother and baby.
Yes.
That, for me, the risk of having a hysterectomy is pretty horrifying, but that's just sort of like, and there's a risk that you might have a hysterectomy. It's just sort of brushed over, but the emphasis is on that 1 in 200, which I find quite fascinating. Yeah. And things like the risk of, with each pregnancy impact, it increases your risk of having placenta previa, placenta accreta,
One of the things that comes up in response to that, I think what's really important, And what I really encourage women to do that have had a cesarean section, and this is going back to our original sort of transfer to the hospital having a section, even before she falls pregnant, at the end of each, event, birthing, I like, and I'm sure that I think you're the same way, by the time that I finish up care with that woman, I want to have a copy, a record of her medical experience. So usually at about a week or two into it, if not before that, I usually ask the woman to consent to the release of medical records.
Yeah.
And I write urgent on it. And most regional hospitals are really, really good that way. I put urgent on it. And within 24, 48 hours, I mean, God bless these beautiful, beautiful people, the medical records people. And then I get it, in a, very secure sort of email. And I get a copy of her notes. And I actually ask for not only the discharge summary, which is very, very, I mean, how often you just get, you don't even know what's going on. They hint at what might happen and what didn't happen. And it's like, yeah, that's really vague. And it's probably done by someone who hasn't even looked at the woman, basically flipping through the notes as they do it. But to get past the discharge summary and the perinatal data, which is, the stats, very vague, very basic, I actually asked for the OR records, the post-recovery, intensive care notes of the baby. I asked for, and that also can be written on the same time. I asked for the progress notes, all the pathology or laboratory tests, because it's not really pathology, it's actually lab tests. So I asked for that. So by the time 6 weeks comes along, she's hopefully moved into establishing breastfeeding, she's on a roll, and that's sort of the end of our care for lots of reasons. But I also like to sit and say, right, let's go through this. And it's even better if the husband's there. So we can all sit down together and go through the notes and her ideas and what she thinks happened and what he thinks happened. And where is the baby? Oh, the baby was over there. Well, what was happening to the baby while you were here and you were here? It's a really good opportunity to debrief, but also get a really clear picture of what everybody's opinion or experience was, including the staff at the hospital. So that to me is a really good way of creating a space for a VBAC next time. So
absolutely,
preparing for a VBAC, the stats are there and they're going to get the story from their obstetrician, whatever, and they're going to have a consult, whatever. But if they've had that opportunity to sit down with their notes and go through it, they've got a really clear picture of what happened and possibly what they can do differently next time. And that will start then their whole process of developing or gaining information, doing their research, so that then when they do walk into that obstetric visit with the next child wanting a VBAC, they've got a really good, solid, they'll know so much more. They're the experts. Suddenly, oh, well, in this situation, here are my notes from the past one. And it'll actually pull that obstetrician back.
Yeah.
And so that the relationship then become much more equal, and she'll respond in a more collegial sort of way with the woman. And then stats won't be just flung out and off the cuff sort of comments like you just mentioned. And those things will be probably not very likely because that person's going to be on notice. This woman is actually really together with her care and what's happened in the past.
So a question about that, Terry. So what would you recommend to somebody who hasn't had a private midwife or hasn't had that opportunity? Would you recommend that they get their notes and debrief with the hospital, or to seek out somebody independent to debrief with?
I would say that your GP probably, your GP is going to be probably the most likely person that, if you have a GP, is probably the most likely person to sit with and say, okay, I've had this happen. And here are my notes. I'd like to go through them with you and blah, blah, blah. The other option is, of course, at your 6 week, because every woman is supposed to or is encouraged to go and see her GP at 6 weeks for a pap smear or whatever. Well, I would probably, get rid of that cervical screening and let's go through the medical records. So that's something that I would probably encourage all women to do. If that doesn't happen at that time, the woman can still, I've had a woman just recently who was able to get the medical records from her first and second cesarean sections. And she had this already before I even involved myself in her care. And so women can go and ask medical records to release this information. And I'm not sure if you need a doctor's, letterhead or whatever.
I think,
but most
I think if you're getting your notes yourself, you just have to go through the legal department of the hospital. So you just have to
that's
a copy of your notes.
Cool. So all of us, I mean, we have a right to information. We have a right to our notes because they're our notes. But like you say, there'll be maybe a hop, skip, and a jump that has to happen in there. Now, if that doesn't happen, let's say she moves from England and she's over here and it's just too hard. I always have asked women when they come to me and want to have a baby vaginally, physiologically at home, after having a cesarean section, I ask them to write their story. And you and I both know how much I love story. And how healing narrative therapy has been around forever, but we're just now being able to recognize this. I always ask women, if we don't have those notes and we can't sit down and talk about it, I ask them to write the whole story down. And I mean, a lot of say, oh, but writing's gone out with the dark ages. Well, then record it or do it on computer. But to have it written down in some form or, documented allows not only, and I always say to her, don't leave anything out. Now, it doesn't mean about time and stuff like that. That can be fairly irrelevant in a situation. If she's got it, or her husband's got it, great, or her partner, or if she doesn't have an ex-partner, whatever she can put down. But not only to put down the details of the actual occurrences, but her feelings. And I feel very strongly that women need to, as they're writing it down, if anger comes up, I'm really angry. That allows for healing. That allows for release of energy. So by the time that we actually sit down, or by the time we sort of, it might be a month, it might be a couple of months, and maybe she needs to really develop a close or trusting relationship with me before she feels comfortable to do that. But to have that time and then to give it to me, and so that we can actually work through the issue, because a lot of times there's post-traumatic stress that's never been dealt with. And so it's best to do it, with the previous one, it actually happens a little bit more than then, but at least it's being done. So that's a step forward from what you said. If you can't get your hands on the notes, or you don't get your hands on the notes.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much what Deb down at Birth Talk encourages women to do as well, is get their notes and to write their story. And it's interesting, when I was working in the hospital system, and I used to say, if I've known they come to the postnatal ward and they've got they've had a really horrific time, I would say to them, write a letter to your child about their birth. Write their birth story for them. You don't ever have to give it to them. And then I would say, and then in 6 weeks' time, write it again. And then in 3 months' time, write it again. Just keep writing that story and see how it changes. However, I started to move into more trauma work now. So I'm doing a lot more birth trauma work with clients around the embodied experience of it. Like really getting into that. We go back into that birth and feel all the feels, the fear, the sadness, the grief, all that, and we process it. And it's actually, I'm absolutely loving it. but it's really interesting, like even births that are 6-10 years ago, and the mother's like, no, I've dealt with all of that. And then we go back into it, and it's like, and the mum's saying afterwards, going, I thought I had dealt with all of those emotions. She said, but I realized I'm still holding all of those things. It's so beautiful. But yeah, I think that's a really important step in moving forward. I agree with you.
And to be honest, Deb, you know, I mean, this is what I do. But the thing is, I also respect and honor that there'll be a point that I can't, that I quite possibly I'll have to look at my scope of practice, for instance, and if there is stuff that comes up, then you know someone with your skills and with your you know experience and what you're learning, that is really important to say, hey, I think you need to talk to, like you say, Deb Gold or Deb, and get something a little bit more formal.
Yeah, and before
you know
I started doing the
I think that's really important.
And before I started doing the work myself, I would send them to see a kinesiologist. Even go see a kinesiologist.
Very good.
Yeah. So, but some women are like, no, I'm actually really good. I'm really good about what happened. I know my journey. You know, I totally owning it. I'm taking responsibility. I'm taking responsibility. I'm stepping up and taking responsibility for my health this time round. I'm getting the knowledge. I'm educating myself. I'm looking after myself, and I trust myself to birth this baby. Yeah. And that's what I love. Going right back to that very beginning of this, when we started talking, when I never wanted to look after VBAC women because they're too high risk. What I got is these women are the most amazing women because they're taking ownership. They're really taking ownership of their bodies and their choices, you know, and they're educating themselves. Like that interview with the obstetrician, and where the woman said, but what about these risks? And it was like, I was blown away. Like she educated herself. And she had the most beautiful birth. And mind you, I'm a bit of a sucker. Every single birth I attend, I learn something new. It's a forever evolving learning practice. You know, yes. I learn from my colleagues. I learn from the women. I learn from their partners, their children, their families, you know.
Yeah. Absolutely. For sure.
Yeah. And it's such a healing journey, isn't it? Yeah. It's, you know.
Yeah, you touched on something quite extraordinary. I think, you know, when I choose to work with a woman, and it's a two-way thing, she chooses to work with me and I choose to work with her. And we know that we're going to have a certain relationship that's going to be quite intimate, be it short-term or long-term. But I do think it's interesting that somewhere along the way, sometimes you know, on occasion, not very often, I could count it on one hand, where I just start wondering whether she's as committed to this as she says she is. And I'm not saying that to be, you know, sort of disregarding women's belief in themselves. But what I do think is that it's early in the piece that I get a feeling that there's something not being dealt with here. And I think it doesn't mean that I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to care for you. But one thing's for sure, as a colleague or as a person that's walking the walk, I need to squeeze her hand. I need to say, hey, I'm getting the feeling something's going on here that hasn't been. And I think that's one of the roles of being a midwife, is that you got to get rid of the bullshit. And so if there is a situation where a woman really wants to, you know, to have a vaginal, and she talks like she really does, but then there's something, she's not either owning it, owning the fact that there was something that she needs to change in order to have the outcome change. You just hinted on that earlier. Or this sort of, oh, well, it happened that, but it's not that, you know, or maybe there's, you know, so I really think I'm blabbing on about it a little bit because I don't want anyone to think that I don't trust women explicitly, but I think I trust everybody, but I also trust my intuitive gut feeling. And if my gut's saying to me, and I guess that's Joy's being a crone, I can do stuff like this, and in compassion and with honest humiliation, to look at this, say, hey, look, I've been getting the feeling this is going on, or this, I'm, you know, looking at this and I get a feeling you're avoiding that. And we need to sit down and talk. So honest, open communication is also really important, isn't it, Deb? When you're working
absolutely, absolutely.
And it's not just people that have had cesarean sections. It could be anybody with any sort of traumatic sort of experience in their life. But I do think since we're on, you know, cesarean section, having a vaginal birth after that, it is really vital that women understand that in order for me to provide the support that she needs, I need to have an opportunity to be able to share my feelings and my gut feelings in particular. And so that that can be looked at. And it's never meant to be an insult. If it touches a sore spot, maybe there's a reason that it's a sore spot. So I would like women to encourage them to remain open. If a midwife says,
I was going to say it's a really good mirroring exercise, isn't it? Of you being following your gut instinct and being open and able to share that with a client. You're ultimately giving her the opportunity. You're sort of saying, you know, this is how I am. You know, come back to me. You know, like am I making sense when I say mirroring that? Like it's the leading by example. So you're opening up and talking to her, and in return she's like, oh, okay, so I must be safe. It must be safe for me to share from where she's coming from, because because a lot of these women, sorry, I say women, I'd say that sounded really like a generalization, but a lot of families that have had a previous cesarean section have had quite a traumatic experience, and that some of that trauma is that they felt their choices were taken away from, they didn't feel heard, you know, their questions weren't answered, they were brushed aside, or, you know, these are a lot of the things that people express to me, that, you know, they just didn't feel heard. So here you are as a practitioner giving her the space, or them the space, to really open up and be heard. I think is a really powerful tool.
We used to call it, when I was doing my undergrad, we had to take counseling courses. And one of the things we talked about was co-counseling. It was quite a buzz word, to co-counsel, having co-counseling situations. So
Sorry, I just had to, my door's slamming over there. I just had to go turn it. Stop it. Put a rug in there to stop it slamming.
So that co-counseling, and I think being on equal terms with the woman, and I guess that's a really interesting place to be too, because when I know a lot of times they talk about your scope of practice and the sort of, when does the professional become the personal, and I think that's a whole other kettle of fish. But I think when it comes to someone who's having making the choice of wanting to have for me, home birth, because I don't usually attend women in hospital anymore as a private practice midwife. I need, like I've told you many times, I want to go to that birth and have fun. And I mean, it sounds a little bit, but what I'm really saying is that I want to be able to go in there and have no doubts. I want to know that we have opened up all the doors.
Yeah.
Everything has been open, and we've clear communication. We've got clear expectations of care, and yeah, and that we know that we can tell each other anything.
Yeah.
That that has to do with the birth, and I think that to me is probably one of the biggest things. And looking at stats, I'm sure this is true. There's the continuity of care isn't just continuity of care. It's much deeper than that, and that intimate relationship that a midwife and a mother and father have, that makes a huge difference to the outcomes.
Absolutely,
and I think that
I think, and being in private practice, there, if someone was planning to have continuity of care and choosing a home birth, or not a home birth, so a private midwife, what I love about private midwifery, as opposed to the continuity of cares in the hospital, not saying that they're bad, but you get to choose the midwife that is the best suited to you. I often have a little joke with clients when I first meet them and say, feel free to go meet other midwives, have a chat, see who's around, be comfortable with them. Like, ultimately, I'm going to see you naked, and I want you to be comfortable with me in that.
And not only naked in the physical sense, but naked, and birth is one place where, and I've been listening to the men talk about their women, and the nakedness isn't the issue as far as their physical nakedness. It's the nakedness of the soul, and the nakedness of their rawness and their vulnerability, and everything that comes from transitioning into a mother-led child. So the nakedness is huge, and you do want to choose someone that you're really vibrating with. And I think that's a big difference, isn't it, when you choose VBAC in the hospital and VBAC in the home? Because a lot of women have been put right into the obstetrical corner. They don't get MGP, they don't get, because of their category. And so what happens there, of course, is they see a new obstetrician and a new midwife every time they come in for the consult. So, and this allows for being a home birth midwife or an independent practice with that, with choosing. That's exactly right. You're going to get to know that person naked on all accounts. So
on all.
I just realized. So we've only just scraped the surface. Sorry, you're breaking up a little bit. Sorry. I just realized that it's 2:15. And I think it would be good if we, that sort of is a good introduction into this whole thing. But I would like to see more, more talk about this maybe in a couple of, when are we going to do the next one?
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
Yeah. So my feeling is that it at least gives women at least a start. And I've got heaps of information, and so does Deb, research that we've, referred to here. Places that you can start looking if you're a woman who's looking at that option. Podcasts for you and your partner.
There's so many VBAC podcasts.
So much. So what we could do is we could put stuff up on our Dreaded Midwife page, so you can have a look after watching this particular video, and then you can come, with your questions and that sort of thing. And please, questions up on our site is really good. And have download some of the stuff that we're going to put up in the next couple of days, and then we can come to it, because we haven't even started to talk about, I mean, we've covered the bigness, haven't we, Deb? But the other things that, so much more.
It's such a deep topic that can, there's just so many rabbit holes to go down. Or it's a bit like, I just had a visual of a labyrinth. There's so many different paths rather than a rabbit hole. You're walking the labyrinth down the VBAC path. There's so many different aspects to look at, so many different things to think about. I think today I think we really covered that, you know, that initial, that fear around uterine rupture. I think that was really well, you know, covered.
I think,
and I'll put some of these research articles up and the book and that sort of stuff. It's and I'm sure you've got heaps of resources as well.
So
but,
so we'll do that, and then you know, and really, because it is a bit of a labyrinth, your comment, people's comments who watch this, please put questions up, so that will give us an idea where to go.
Definitely.
I mean, Deb and I, we love talking about all sorts of things, and certainly this topic is going to be, you know,
we do ramble, so
but we do start, and we cover stuff that's important to us and what we've seen in our experience, but we always really want to hear from other people and what they want to talk about.
So you can comment. We're going to put this video up on YouTube. We're going to have the Spotify episode as well. We also have the Facebook page, The Dreaded Midwives, and we don't have a website yet. I'm working on it. But yeah, so you can leave comments on the YouTube channel or on our Facebook page. And yeah, we'll carry on the conversation in a couple of weeks, Terry, and hopefully Kristy will be free to come and play with us, bring her wonderful knowledge and, you know, freshness.
Yeah, and I think working in the system, because she probably sees more Caesarean sections than we do, or VBACs, it'd be really interesting to get her take, not only because they're more recent experiences, but also because because she also has a really good handle on research, where we're flipping through papers and so on. But, you know, so I look forward to that one as well, Deb. Okay. Well, I'm going to sign off, and mwah to you and everyone else.
Yes. See you all later. Talk in 2 weeks. Bye.